The one with the Facebook up top left.
There?
Yeah. No, up at the browser, the top left tab. To the right.
There?
Yes. And then you hit go live down there. Okay. And you should be good now.
Can people see me?
Yeah.
But it's small.
No, that's just you just scroll down. You see.
Oh,
That's
okay.
what
All right. Oh, wait. Now I'm not there.
Scroll up again.
I did scroll up. See, I'm not. Oh, now I don't know what happened.
Go back to YouTube.
Which is, where is that?
The right tab. The rightmost tab.
That over here?
Up top. See the
yeah.
browser tabs.
This.
To the right. Yeah, go ahead and click right there.
Okay. I'm computer illiterate. That's true. You bet. Yeah. You bet. No problem. No problem. Okay. We are here covering chapter 5 of Joshua, and I figured we ought to start with a prayer on this day of Pentecost. Good stuff. Dear Father, thank you for bringing us here today. Help us, Father, as we study your book of Joshua to learn all that we can from it, to understand what it means for us as Christians. I say and ask these things in the name of your dearly beloved Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So this chapter is very interesting. There's a whole lot of stuff in it. So there's a lot of background information I want to get into in it. But if somebody could read verse 1 of chapter 5.
As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel.
So these people are terrified right now because they have melted heart and no spirit because of the children of Israel that are coming. And so basically, when they said they had a melted heart, that's a complete loss of strength. They did not have anything that they could fight with because they were coming and they had seen that the river Jordan had dried up for them and they were crossing and coming over. So they were stunned and terrified by the Israelite army and the God that was with them. So they were afraid of that. So for the Canaanites, this was a real horror story. They were terrified by the Israelite hordes. There were some 2 million strong coming at them. Of course, they had the fighting people, but the whole nation was coming at them. So they're spreading along the eastern bank of the Jordan. And they intended to invade the western lands when the waters ceased flowing. And of course, there was a flood stage, so that when the water ceased like that, they were watching them go across this. And they knew the battle was imminent. It was coming really, really quick. So when you think about this, worldly wisdom would have called for an immediate attack against Jericho while Jericho was disheartened and they were afraid. However, God called for a 3-day delay while Israel observed 2 sacraments during this time. In this, the Amorites and the Canaanites, they are summaries of all the people described, all the Gentile nations that are in this area. So they're just summarized by that at this point. So when the Lord dried the waters up of the Jordan, this parting of the water was not only a testament to Israel, but it was a warning that God's judgment was on the way, coming through the armies of Israel. Now they didn't believe; they believed in multiple gods, but they knew that this one was going to punish them, and they had faith in that, although they believed other gods. So at this point, the prostitute Rahab had already reported that the spies, that reported on the spies, and so the whole town was terrified. at the great things that God was going to do for them. And so they were basically fearing the judgment that was coming from the Lord Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. So they were terrified of that. And basically, the Canaanites saw that the Israeli God, took action. Their gods, their pagan gods were silent. They didn't help them at all. But the Lord our God took action against them. And so they're sitting there just terrified at all that. So if somebody could read verses 2 and 3.
At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haaraloth. And this is the reason.
Is that all of it?
That's verse 2 and 3.
Yeah, okay. So when they used the flint knives to circumcise them, since the Exodus, none of the Israelis born during the 40 years in the wilderness were circumcised. There's no biblical record of any circumcision during that time. They had neglected this, and they're not entirely sure why, but they were not following the Lord at that point, because they just dropped it off and didn't do it. And part of the thing that I wanted to discuss is the idea of circumcision and what that meant to the Israelites. It goes back to Abraham and God's covenant with him. So the Abrahamic covenant is this, and I'll summarize it from Genesis chapter 12, 2 and 3. It says, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So here he's talking about not just the Israelites, but all nations of the earth are going to be blessed through Abraham. And that's an amazing thing. When the circumcision happened after this blessing, so Abraham, his belief was prior to circumcision. So the circumcision was just a physical manifestation of this covenant that God was making with him. And so in Hebrew, the covenant is called a beret, and that was an agreement between parties. It was like a contract. So it served as a form of a constitution as to what each party would do during this beret. So basically, you have to ask you why circumcision? What's the point in that? Because obviously it was cutting off the fold of the penis at the end of it. So at that point they were marked as God's covenant people. And so if a Gentile was uncircumcised, they could never be allowed into Israel's covenant. They would never get into the land that God's promising them. So in this, because it was part of procreation, so anytime they would see their covenant when they had sexual relations, they would see that and remember that they were made by God. They were marked by Him. So it's a physical covenant that they had. And the thing is, now as Christians, we practice a circumcision of the heart. So it's through the blood of Christ on the cross that we're saved. And He is the circumcision through His shed blood. And that's how we're saved in that. So basically, Israel has been given this practice, this challenge of going to war with the Canaanites. And there are battles, but there are always great blessings that come from the battles that we fight. So there's always battles in the Christian life that we have today. And sometimes the greater the battle, the greater the blessing. As our church becomes successful, Satan is constantly at war against us. previous Pastor Ed was talking to Don, our president, and he said, Satan's out after you now because your church is successful. He said, whenever you have a successful church, Satan will be right in the middle of it, trying to throw it down. Because as Christians, if you're following the Bible and you believe in that, he does not want that. If you're a kind of person that's like partying and listening to heavy metal and all that stuff, he doesn't care about you. He's got you, no problem. But when churches are successful, that's when things start getting weird as far as, you know, and we don't know what that's going to be, but Satan is definitely there. So it's, as Christians, we have to press into God. Bible reading, the armor of God that was discussed in Ephesians that we talked about before. These are all things that we have to do to keep from falling into Satan's trap. Got to read the Bible. Got to understand it anymore. It really is so necessary for us to do that. And what we're doing here today is part of that whole process. So here, before they engaged in war, before they rushed in to attack Jericho, the Israelites had to learn some vital lessons while they waited at Gilgal. And they're waiting to receive instructions from God. And this is something that Christians find hard to do, waiting for God to instruct us on different things. So I have a question. Is it hard to wait for God when his answers are uncomfortable, or to wait? And how do we practice our faith in God, who we know works out all things for our good?
I think it is. Yeah. Or to,
I think it's one of those situations where the Israelites at this time very obviously had, the Ark of the Covenant that, or wherever it goes, we're going to go.
Right.
That seems to be the story up to this point. Wherever the Ark goes, that's where I'm going to go. And
Right.
so it was, in a sense, a little bit easier to wait because you just had to walk whenever that moved.
Right. Exactly.
For us today, there's a little bit more open to our discretion in a lot of things. There are things that God very definitely does say to do, and then
Right.
there are things where, well, it's left up to. This is part of the liberty that we have in Christ, is that we get to creatively follow His instructions. Like, all right, feed the poor. Well, how are we going to do that?
Yeah.
We have a plethora of ways in which to do that. Or be kind and loving to your neighbor. Well, there's not a time frame or like these are the steps that you do to love your neighbor.
Right.
We have a lot of liberty, and so following God now is more of a are you going to put in the effort rather than necessarily waiting on a timing sort of issue.
Right. And it's I can talk about my own circumstances, that when Jenny and I came to the Lutheran Church, we were looking for a church, and we wanted Andrew to have a church upbringing and that kind of stuff. So we got in touch with this lady who gave us. We were influenced by her church. 1,000 members there, good for kids, and so this is where we started out. When we started going to church, I would give $3 a week, $1 for each of us, and that to me was, when I gave, and so, but as time goes on, you start to change, and now it's like, oh yeah, I see what they got to pay bills. We got to do this stuff to keep the church open, So just even in that, and our faith has grown, just different things that have happened in our lives and our friends and everything. So it becomes like you said, it people grow in their spirituality, and I think it's wonderful to see that. To see my wife, her involvement with church has grown so much. And it wasn't like she wasn't a Christian before, but when I look at that, I think, wow, that's amazing. See somebody work like that and do it. So, yeah. So that when they talk about the flint knives, this is interesting because the Israelites had metals that they could use, but this is kind of symbolic because in previous areas, God had commanded the people to make altars for them and to not have stone touch the altars. So they wouldn't use the tool of iron because this would pollute the altar, pollute the sacrifice. And you can look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, and Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 5 to look at that. So you don't want to use an instrument of iron, especially when you're doing something and when the body and the soul were in a most solemn manner being sanctified in that. So these flint knives are actually probably made of obsidian, which is extremely smooth and very sharp. And so when he's doing this stuff, and this is kind of interesting, I was reading this and they talked about the hill of foreskins. I just had this image in my mind of them collecting, and it's like, no, it wasn't like that. They didn't have piles of,
Oh, the hill was made of
made of
No.
foreskins.
I mean, a million is a lot, but I doubt it would make a hill.
I mean, I just had this image in my mind. It's like Monty Python. It's just, weird. But so this is the place where all the men were asked to be circumcised. And so they didn't make a hill out of it, but it was the place where these surgeries happened. So it just became known as the Hill of Foreskins. So God was reaffirming his covenant with Abraham through these people circumcising themselves, promising them the land of Canaan. He warned that anybody that was not circumcised, change my book here, would be violating the covenant. And that's from Genesis chapter 17, verses 7 through 14. So consequently, before this, Israel could not claim the covenant of the land until the sign of the covenant, the circumcision, had been restored. So now these people are there. They're all being circumcised. And so basically the men of the generation that left Egypt had been circumcised, but that generation did not obey the voice of the Lord. And they failed to take by faith the promise of the land flowing with milk and honey. So they quit circumcising because of this failure to trust God. And of course, that generation, they died in the wilderness, as God had said. You're not going to touch my promised land until this generation dies out. And so it was affirmed by the law of God given at Mount Sinai. And yet there was no circumcision during the 40-year Exodus. So after the first Passover was held, when they were leaving Egypt, Israel commemorated a second Passover at Mount Sinai 1 year later. And they probably circumcised all who had been born the previous year before the celebration. But then again, there's no record of a Passover at Sinai or in the 39 years of the Exodus. And it's likely that no children were circumcised after the Sinai Passover until Israel crossed the Jordan. So this generation of people from Joshua chapter 5 took it upon themselves for the responsibilities of this covenant. And through this circumcision, they could lay claim to the promises of that land that God had given to Abraham and his descendants. So this is where Joshua circumcises their sons. circumcision was not unknown in the ancient world. It's a ritual practice among various peoples. Yet for the Israelites, circumcision was to every man a constant, evident sign of this covenant into which they had entered with God and those moral obligations that they had in that. So, of course, there's hygienic reasons for circumcision, which it made sense in the ancient world to have people do that, but that was not really what the Israelites were getting at. More importantly, circumcision is a cutting away of the flesh and an appropriate sign of the covenant for those who should put no trust in the flesh. Like I said, it deals with the organ of procreation, so it was a reminder of the special seed of Abraham, which they would ultimately bring. It would ultimately bring the Messiah to them. So this cutting away of flesh with blood is reminiscent of Jesus' sacrifice and the massive loss of blood that he had on the cross for us, for our salvation. In Colossians chapter 2, St. Paul connected the ideas of circumcision and Christian baptism. His idea was that in Jesus, we are all spiritually circumcised, and that we are also buried with Jesus in baptism. So, but Paul, in that sense, he did not say that baptism is the sign of the covenant that Christians receive and live under, but it was a new covenant. That's Christ talks about this is a new covenant in my blood. So even if that connection is made, it's important to note that one was not genetically born into the covenant, described here in Genesis chapter 17. No one's genetically born into that new covenant. One is not born again into it by God's grace through faith. It's wrong or harmful to make the analogy babies were circumcised, so babies should be baptized. They're two different things. Baptism is a separate thing from the circumcision. So
I think one of the important things in the Colossians passage, it says that baptism is the circumcision made without hands. It's not something that
Right.
people do. Even there's a pastor who's pouring water on the child,
right,
but the important thing in baptism is that it is God is the one who's baptizing them.
right,
It's the promise of God attached to the water, not the fact that the baby or the convert gets wet. It's the promise that is accomplishing the things that are happening in baptism.
right. Absolutely.
So the folks who argue that, well, you have to be a believer before you're baptized is because baptism is a work.
Right.
Is that we would say, well, yes, it's a work. It's a work of God. It's not something that we do to prove that we're
Right.
Christian. It's
Right.
something God does to make us Christian.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, infant baptism. It always blows my mind that, in the Great Commission, Christ says, baptize Christians, and it's the
Baptize all
everybody,
nations.
all nations, and it's like,
There's not an asterisk right there.
no, there's not, and it's, it was hard for me to believe that before I was baptized, I was an enemy of God. Children, enemies of God, really, but they are. without that baptism, without God entering us and saying, "You're my child now. You will follow me." That changes everything, and it's nothing that we do. Nothing that we do. It's all done for us. And when Andrew was baptized, I didn't really have a concept of all that. I just did it because, hey, everybody gets baptized. I mean, I really didn't have an understanding of this stuff, but now I do. And I think it's I thank the good Lord I was baptized, because it just made it made differences to me later on in life. There's things that happened with me that uh, if I hadn't been baptized, I don't think that I'd have survived it. But that's just kind of a personal thing. But
There's another interesting thing with baptism regarding this idea of covenants.
Right.
You have the circumcision, which is the sign of the old covenant, and this new covenant that we have now in Jesus is referred to several times in Scripture as the superior covenant or the higher covenant.
right,
So you have so circumcision, every male in Israel. Well, in baptism, we have not just every male, but every female, and not just this
Right.
one group of people, but all the Gentiles. It's
Right.
an elevating of who gets to be called the people of God.
right,
So it is in a sense connected with the earlier circumcision, but it supersedes it and rises above it.
right, right. Well, yeah, because Abraham had faith before the circumcision.
Right.
So that whole thing about all families, all nations are blessed because of you.
Mhm.
Back when that happened, I can't even imagine I don't know if he had any concept of what that meant, for everybody. I don't know if he really could conceive of that, but isn't that wonderful? It's
That is one of the very admirable thing about all the patriarchs in the Old Testament, because it's like, all right, God's going to do this thing, but not in my lifetime,
right,
not in my grandkids' lifetime.
right,
Like the time scale of, okay, God made me a promise, I'm going to live my whole life never seeing it.
right, right. Yeah, no,
But
that's faith.
But part of the reason why people can live their whole lives looking towards a promise that they never see is because they do have all these pages
Right.
of promises kept.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I
Right.
know that he's kept these promises.
Right.
So from this point on, I can look forward to the other promises he's made.
Right. And the thing that's amazing is that God doesn't lie.
Mhm.
Every single thing he says he's does, he will do it. And it's he's given us time, hours, days, seasons, but he's above all that. That's something it's hard for me to think about. God is above. He's not. Time means nothing to him. This is a little tool that he's given us to find our way through and everything. So it's like, so he sees 1,000 years are like a day to him, kind of thing. So it's just fascinating to me to think that he is above everything and sees all things. And it's like, so a lifetime to us is a lifetime, but to him it's like just not even, so we're seeing this from below looking up, and we have to have faith based on everything in this book, because everything that he talks about comes true, and all the promises that he's given us are going to happen.
And you can see this also in the reaction of the people of Canaan. Like
Right.
they hear the stories of this people that have come out of Egypt.
Right.
And of this God, from their perspective, a new God, not one of the gods that they've heard before.
Exactly.
They didn't use the Yahweh, which is how they translate Lord in verse
Lord,
1.
yeah.
Yahweh was something that Moses revealed to the people of Israel. That wasn't used previously.
Right.
So there's a new God coming out of Egypt, bringing all these folks, and weird things are happening wherever they go.
Right.
And now it's pointed at us.
Right. Right. And Rahab and telling them about it's like, you just got to imagine that they were so terrified that, and they're a pagan city. They have, all the different things that we talked about, the kind of sacrifices and crazy stuff they were doing. They knew they were going to get punished, but they weren't really sure how or why, but they were terrified. They knew that whatever was going to happen, and we see in subsequent chapters how this is going to come through. That it's kind of like they knew they were going to get it.
Well, they had the testimony of Abraham and Isaac the
Right.
entire time that they were wandering through the area.
Right.
And that was a couple those 2 or 3 generations of, well, okay, here's this crazy dude and his flocks and his folks
Yeah, right.
wandering around worshiping a weird god, and that example. It was like before the flood, Noah, just the way that he lived his life. He's called a prophet
Right,
for preaching through his actions, to the people around him.
right.
And they're gonna get it.
Yeah. And they didn't see it. you know.
Back on the promises unseen.
Yeah.
In a sense, modern day Christians are exactly the same. I mean, we're not going to see the promises that we've been made either from God in our earthly lives. So, in a
You
sense,
never know.
Well,
I mean,
We've been waiting for 2,000
yeah, I've been
years,
waiting
so,
for
yeah.
2000, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
I mean, in the last 2,000 years, those promises haven't. So it's not like they waited,
Right,
100 years or 40 years or 500 years,
right.
2,000 so far.
That's true. That's true. But the thing when you look at the prophecies of how people are going to behave in the end times, and we're seeing it, but also there's the other part of it, that the promises for us are going to happen, and we know it's going to happen, because sometimes when you see things in a negative way, like, okay, these things are going to happen, and they are protests, and just, I saw on Facebook there was a lady, it was some protest, and she said, I've had 100 abortions and I'm going to have more because I want to kill the babies. And there was another guy there that was just screaming. He says, there is no God. I'm God. I'm God. And you see this stuff and it's like, how in the world can you? That's horrible. But this is what ego, life without God, this is where it's going to end up, But we also know that the other side of that is coming. And so we know that, when they talk about these things in the end times, it's like, okay, and we don't know specifically, but you look around and you see stuff that's happening, and it just kind of was like, okay, I get it. Just keep going on. We'll get there.
But we just had Ascension Sunday last week.
Right.
That was, and going back and reading through some of Luke, when we were chapter 9, is like that's when Jesus set off for Jerusalem.
Right.
And that's what he says, that he was looking at the ascension as at the end of the path that he was taking.
Right.
And so now we, walking through life, that glory on the other side, that's our hope. That's
Right.
that's what's been promised us. And we know that because we have a God who keeps his promises, and we see the glory that Jesus received,
Absolutely.
we can trust that, well, however long the journey is,
Right.
we're gonna partake in whatever Jesus has.
Right. Right. And that's where endurance comes in. That word endure is in the Bible a lot. and it's, like I said, it's not, we went over that before, the definition of it. It's a hard word.
Yeah.
It really is, but we have the promises on the other side. So, so that's good. If somebody could read verse 8.
Do you want to do 4 to 8?
Is it four? Wait a
But
minute.
we left off at 3, so do we want to do 4 to 8?
Yeah.
And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they came out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation of the men of war who came out of Egypt perished, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. The Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. When the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their place in the camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day.
So So they had this faith, was demonstrated by Israel's obedience and command to be circumcised. So they stayed in their camp until they were healed from that, and they were vulnerable because they were also preparing for God's battle at that point. I can't even imagine what that would be like for an adult male to be circumcised. That, I mean, that had to have hurt. Just thinking. I mean, when I was in the hospital, they catheterized me, and that was horrifying. I can't even imagine a million people, you know, that was, you know, and so in a sense, it was odd for Joshua to incapacitate his whole army by that. And that's silly to the world. From worldly, you know, wisdom, that's not the way you're supposed to fight. But St. Paul said the power of the cross is foolishness to those who don't believe. However, to us, it's the way of salvation. So a lot of times God's stuff doesn't have anything to do with what we think or how we operate. So God told Joshua to do this, and so he followed God in all things. And so the people, knowing that God was with them, they went ahead and did it and followed God through Joshua. They could have found somebody else that maybe would not have wanted them to fight Jericho, but they didn't do that. They followed Joshua and went ahead and circumcised themselves, and they waited for that time to heal. So basically, in this sense, faith in God meant conquest, and they knew that was going to happen, so they waited to heal from that. So in our sense, God does a similar work in his people today. God takes away the dishonor and shame of our previous sin and rebellion and lifts his people into the freedom and high standing in Christ Jesus. Amazing. You know, we are children of the Holy God through our baptism. And so in this sense, faith and obedience on the part of God's people means grace and saving. And I was looking up the word obedience. It's just an interesting word in the Bible. And what it is, it's a definition of it. It said, obedience is to act in accord with what is commanded by another authority. In Hebrew, obey is essentially the same as hear. And the name of hear is Shema in Hebrew. In Greek, it is, and I'll spell it to you because I can't, it's hypakoio, I think, Hypakoyo. Another Greek word is peitho, Peitho, which is to be persuaded. So obeying God is an intimate and personal thing, and it grows out of our relationship with the Lord. And it exists only where there's faith in the love of God. So that's their concept of obedience. It's kind of a double-edged thing that they do. So, yeah. So in this, Israel remembers God's work for the redemption from Egypt. So in Genesis, in chapter 12, Israel escapes the Egyptians through the Red Sea, and they're running from them. They're running from an enemy. In Joshua's time, on the same day as their escape from Egypt, Israel is now free. So they're not running away from somebody, they're running to something. And so the great work of redemption is completed. They are a free people at this point. They're out of the wilderness and entering the promised land. So they're entering into this new covenant promise. So at this point, let's see if I lost track here. You read till when? When did you read till?
Verse 9. So
Hang on a second, let me get this. Got to find my place here. Okay, yeah, if somebody could read, hang on a second. I got to find it here.
10 through 12. is
10
that-
through 12, yeah. Read that.
While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year.
So, this is amazing stuff. When God stops the manna, He provided this for the Israelites in the desert, and that was their food, that and the quail. And so, when they come to the Promised Land, they're able to harvest food, eat the food that was there. So they no longer needed the manna, and he had provided that for them in the desert. So when Israel was able to provide for themselves from the produce of Canaan, and basically that was kind of a fertile crescent where Jericho was at. So God didn't want Israel to get lazy, but to live in a new partnership with Him. And so they don't have to have the manna because they're able to produce food for themselves. And this is a real blessing for them. So if someone could read 13 through 15.
when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his feet to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so.
That goes right back to Moses. Take your shoes off your feet, for you are standing on holy ground. Who is this man that he sees?
It's a theophany.
Yeah,
It's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ.
absolutely. Absolutely. And when you say a theophany, that it is Christ. So is a theophany is it a manifestation? I'm not sure I understand what the definition of that is.
Well, I mean, it's kind of something hard to think about in general.
Right.
You have, well, for example, Abraham. He entertains three guests with bread before
Right,
the whole
right.
Sodom and Gomorrah incident,
Okay.
and that's the Lord and two angels, but
Okay.
they're described as men. So they eat bread.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a very peculiar thing. Uh, and yet, this is not the same thing as when Jesus came to be incarnate, being born of Mary. It's
Right.
somehow different, um, because that is a very special thing that happened. And because otherwise, you would think Jesus could appear, start preaching,
Right. And then
and then that'd be it. But there is something about the way in which he shows up here that is different in some physical capacity from when he was incarnate as Jesus.
right. And then all of the fires of in Daniel when they threw those guys in
Yes,
the
yes,
fire.
and the man in the fire.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an amazing thing because at this point, uh, Joshua is meeting the commander of the army of the Lord. And so he comes and he boldly approaches this mysterious man with a drawn sword. And he is a shepherd over God's people. So at this point, Joshua has a responsibility to see if this armed man was a friend or a foe. And he's a figure with a drawn sword, so he's not to be toyed with at this point. So he's going to find out from him. And he says, so the sword in his hand is not the minister's hand in baptism. The power of the gospel, when Jesus holds and gnashes into the hearts of adamant people to change their lives, that's powerful. And this is what he's seeing in this. So when he says, are you for us or our adversaries? The man says no. And that's kind of an odd thing for someone to say. But the question wasn't really not the right question for Joshua to ask him. The more important question to be asked would be whether Joshua. The question really wasn't if the Lord was on Joshua's side. The proper question was if Joshua and the people of Israel that were with him were on the Lord's side. And that's the big question. And so he's saying, I'm here. I will fight for you. And again, I love that. Take your sandals off your feet. It goes right back to Moses. So in a sense, Joshua was the new Moses, and he was taking over for him. And I can only imagine he developed that over the course of time. The power he gets from God, he's getting comfortable with it. He's getting used to it.
I was thinking the same thing so here's a man, perhaps like when angels appear and stuff like that, typically there's an aura about them that this is more than just a guy.
Right.
And he already has his sword drawn, and it says Joshua went up to him.
Right.
It's like, are you on our side or are you my enemy?
Right.
And it doesn't even say he drew his sword first.
Right.
He's
Right.
totally confident confronting this dude who might be here to assassinate him.
Right. Exactly. It's true. It's funny, think about that. I mean, that when you read these things and it's like the emotions and the things that people went through during this time when they're getting ready to attack Jericho, and they had to have faith that God was with them. And of course, there's all this stuff with the setting up the stones and all the different things, and they see that that this is God's work. And of course, when the Jordan goes back to the way it was before, there's just all these things that happen that kind of encourage them along. It's like, I am here with you. I will fight for you. And so, yeah. Does anybody have anything else to say about it?
I think it's interesting, as you said earlier, in human reason, we might think the city's afraid. We just had this amazing event crossing the river. It would make sense to attack now, right?
Right.
If it was based on the strength of Israel to take Jericho, you would think time is of the essence. You have to move now.
Right.
And yet they incapacitate themselves for 3
Right.
days, and then they celebrate the Passover. And it's obvious that they've come this far by listening to God and only
Right.
moving when He tells them to move. That they seem very confident that it's going to happen, and it's going to be God who takes the city for us.
Right.
And He's going to provide a way, even if now they've had 4-5 extra days to prepare now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's amazing. And of course, in subsequent chapters, we're going to see how that all works out.
Yeah.
It's chapter 6 is going to be really interesting to see how that works out. So, that's all I've got for my research. So if that, we'll close with prayer. That sound good? Yeah. Oh, dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for bringing us here to study your word, learn about the incredible things that you did through Joshua to save your people. Thank you for bringing us here today to worship you in your house, and help us to appreciate this wonderful time that you've given us. I ask these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Amen.
Right.
Yes.
You have to wear that white robe today?
No, I do not. He's going to wear the white robe. So how do I turn this thing off here?
Okay, so it's gonna have stream down here at the bottom.
Okay, right there.
Yeah, and then you're gonna want to click confirm that you're ending it.
Right there.
Yep. Hit it again.